Howdy, Roadrunners. Let's take a look now at our next topic, the rise of big business. First, before we get started, I want to point out a couple of things in Chapter 18 that I want you to be aware of. Now, Chapter 18, remember, is happening at the same time or slightly after Chapter 16, and then again with Chapter 17, which you're going to come up with. Look at the topic of the North during the Reconstruction in the Gilded Age. It's going to give you a broad overview of what's going on there. I want you to be able to compare it to what's happening in the South and what's happening in the West. So kind of a compare and contrast exercise here. Now specifically in Chapter 18, I want you to note some issues of race, class, and gender, how they play out in Northern society, especially the rise of this new middle class, how they define themselves, how they are different than an old middle class, and how they distinguish themselves from the other classes. So now, let's get into the rise of big business. Remember, we talked earlier in the semester during our discussion of industrialization that there were a number of unintended consequences resulting from industrialization. And one, of course, was this massive shift into a very unstable economy, an economy that's characterized by boom and bust, recession and depression and prosperity. Nobody had expected that. So now we're going to have to come up with some ways, we're going to have to come up with some ways here to be able to try to even that out, try to smooth that out. Now, according to a recent census, there are about 22 million businesses operating in the United States. Of those 22 million, if we put the 21,999,500 businesses on a teeter-totter or a balance beam against the largest 500, we'll have to put that balance point right about there. 500 corporations have equal economic power to the other 21,999,500. This is an enormous shift in concentration of power and wealth. 500 American corporations dominate the American economy. Now, you can go here to the Fortune 500. I'll put a link up on Blackboard. Fortune 500, published every year by Forbes magazine, lists the top 500 companies. Now, what I'd like for you to do when you get a chance, and this won't take very long, but to go to the Fortune 500 and just scroll down, and you'll see a lot of companies that you recognize, Walmart being the number one, the biggest company by revenue, but then you'll see a bunch of others that you don't really know what these companies do. And that's kind of scary because they have so much power and so much influence in the American economy. So we got to look at what's happened here. Remember, we historians like change. We want to know what changed and why it changed. And here, certainly, the rise of big business in the late 19th century is one of those enormous changes. Now, having said that, understand that big business is not the same as industrialization. Okay? Big business is, in fact, a consequence of industrialization, just like these erratic economic cycles. And the rise of these big businesses is in fact an attempt for businessmen to try to deal with the uncertainties of this erratic economic cycle. So first we've got to define what is a big business. In the years after the Civil War, let's say, just pick a random date, let's say 1870, a new corporate firm emerges. Now, what's new here, and I think I'd like for you to scratch out emerges and write in becomes dominant. Because it's not like in 1869 there were no big businesses and now suddenly in 1870 there are. This is a gradual process that begins as early as the 1820s, but now after the Civil War, let's say beginning in the 1870s, this new corporate form that we call big business becomes dominant. It becomes uh, the way that businessmen are going to try to solve some of their new problems. Now, corporation is not what's new. We've seen corporations going all the way back to the Virginia Company or the Massachusetts Bay Company in the very early days of English colonization here. What's new is the size and the scale of these corporations. Now, let me kind of draw this out for you. In 1776, let this circle represent the entirety of the American economy. There's a famous economist named Adam Smith, and Adam Smith kind of wrote a book that defined how capitalism works. He didn't invent capitalism, he just wrote the rule book, let's say. In 1776, Smith looked out on the economy, and what he saw were millions of small producers, farmers, shopkeepers, tradesmen of different type. And none of these guys were big enough to have an influence that could influence supply and demand. This is what he called the invisible hand, supply and demand. He called it the invisible hand because these are the powers, he said, L-E, hand. These are the powers that determine what products are made, what quantity these products will be made in, and then what the selling price of these products will be. And none of these producers could alter those natural laws. He said it's the natural law of supply and demand. This invisible hand regulates the economy. Now, we jump forward a few years now to 1876. 100 years after Adam Smith wrote his book, and now we see a completely different American economic landscape. Now, we've still got small groups here and there, but we've seen the emergence, the rise of huge corporations employing tens or hundreds of thousands of people worth millions and millions of dollars. Now, these corporations now is what historian Alfred Chandler calls the visible hand of corporate management, because now these few large businesses in each industry, in every sector, are able to manipulate the laws of supply and demand for their own benefit. They have the power to get together and fix prices. They seem exempt then from these natural laws. Instead, they can make their own laws. They can shape the marketplace to their well-being through either increasing their production, driving prices down, cutting back their production, trying to drive prices up, by advertising, trying to manipulate demand to encourage you to buy their product rather than somebody else's product. But now, these corporations that are very big and worth lots and lots of money have become the dominant form of business throughout now the late Gilded Age. And their influence in the economy simply grows the further we get into the late 19th century. Now, these big businesses, having the power to manipulate markets, seem like they operate on their own. They're immune to these natural forces. And this gives rise to an attitude by the owners, the managers of these big businesses, that they don't have to keep the public safety or the public benefit in mind. All they are concerned about is their profit and their ability to stay in business. And so it sets these big businesses and the tycoons, the businessmen that founded and created them, kind of at odds with the betterment of society, because what's good for them is not always good for society, and what's good for society is maybe not all that good for them. So we're going to have an adversarial relationship start to develop. Now, today, we hardly think about this because our economy is dominated by large corporations, and we understand that these large corporations provide us with the things that we need at prices that we can afford, giving us a certain material lifestyle that's relatively comfortable. But this caused a big concern in the late 19th century because it seemed so contradictory to how a capitalist economy was supposed to work. So, to understand what a big business is, we need to kind of define it. According to historian Alfred Chandler, a big business has certain distinctive characteristics that set it apart, certainly from small businesses, but also from medium-sized businesses. Think of this as kind of a checklist or a set of criteria. If you meet all of these characteristics, you are clearly a big business. If you meet none of these characteristics, then you're clearly a small business. The gray area comes in between. What if you meet 3 of them but not all 4? Well, again, for all intents and purposes, you could be considered a bigger business, even though you don't meet all of the criteria. So keep in mind that this is not a 100% foolproof definition, but it's more of a description. Now, Chandler says that one of the first distinctive characteristics of a big business, whoops, didn't want that, is that they have a high investment in plant and equipment. And what this means is that these corporations have huge amounts of money invested in the tools and the factories and the buildings and the warehouses and the office space and even the desks and the computers and everything else necessary to run this business. It's to the point now where these big businesses are so expensive to even start that it discourages other people from getting into that same business. For example, you're going to need, if you want to produce steel now by, let's say, 1890, you're going to have a steel factory as big as Andrew Carnegie's, one that's cost him hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars to be able to put together here. Now, this means that only a handful of people are able to put together the money to be able to start this business. So, you've got to spend this money to build the equipment, to buy the machines and the tools and hire the workers before you can produce anything. So that high investment is kind of a limitation. It serves as a limitation on who can participate in this particular business. Now, a second characteristic is that these big businesses operate on a national scale and increasingly on a global scale. But when Chandler was writing in 1970, globalization was not as big a deal as it is today. So he simply limited his description to national scale. In other words, with these high investment in plant and equipment, these businesses are able to produce huge quantities of goods, quantities that our local area simply can't purchase all of them. So they're going to have to go out and find customers now on a regional and increasingly on a national scale. In other words, they are what we would call multi-locational. In other words, they operate in multiple locations. And I think probably your best example of this, and one of the earliest of the big businesses, were the railroads that are going to have warehouses and track yards and operations centers and ticket booths at all of these different places around the globe. They operate multiple locations. Now, simply having a railroad like the Union Pacific that runs across a good portion of the United States, or the Southern Pacific that runs across a good portion of the southern U.S., simply can't do business in one place. They are by definition multi-locational. But now we see this multi-locational pattern start to come into manufacturing. For instance, up here in Detroit, Michigan, is the home to Ford and Chevrolet and Chrysler, but they produce their cars in different factories all over the country, and then they sell those cars in just about every little town across the country. So even in retailing, in banking, in manufacturing, these businesses operate increasingly on a national scale, and now we would say that they operate on a global scale. So that's the second criteria, that they operate on this national scale as they seek customers in as wide a geographic area as they can. Now, a third characteristic is that they have bureaucratic management structures. Bureaucratic, again, that's one of those words everybody knows but nobody can spell, and I hope I spelled it correctly there. But what this means is that authority within the corporation is divided. No one single person or even one single group of people perform all of the tasks necessary to run this business. That they're going to divide these responsibilities up, both horizontally and vertically. They're going to divide things horizontally by levels of management. And then they're going to divide things vertically by department. For instance, here you have the administrative department, which contains the human resources division. And over here is the finance department. Now, the administrative department and human resources, they hire people and they make sure everybody knows what kind of benefits they get or don't have. They have nothing to do. The people that work in human resources have nothing to do, say, with the accounting division. There's no connection. And the guy that runs the administrative department has no authority over people who work in the accounting division. And the finance department, the manager there, has no authority over human resources. Then you get over, let's say, to the engineering department and the research and development division. These are the people that are coming up with the new products and testing them. Now that's completely different than the maintenance department, who's responsible for, well, maintaining the machines and things like that to produce the goods that the company needs. Then you have different layers of management. There's going to be, for each one of these light blue divisions or departments, somebody in charge of that, whose sole responsibility is to make sure operations run smoothly in that particular area and have no authority over anything else. Then here in, say, the gold, you've got a division manager, or in this case it says a department manager, who oversees operations and directly supervises the guys or gals that run these departments underneath them. And the head of the engineering department now reports to the assistant general manager, who then reports to the general manager or the CEO, who then reports to the board of directors, who are mostly the largest shareholders in the country. And so we divide responsibility both horizontally, both horizontally and vertically. Now, how we coordinate this then is through a written policy manual. And in your job, you might have heard your boss say things like, around here we do things by the book. And what he means by that is they follow the rules laid out in the corporate operations manual, that every department and every job has a specific description, so that a new employee coming in, say, to the procurement division, the buying department essentially, knows exactly from day one what his or her responsibilities are. They have to do this, they have to do that, they're not allowed to do this. And that's so that anybody can come and go in the corporation and with just a little bit of training know what their job is. Now, you can communicate and this authority stays intact. It's therefore rather restrictive, because somebody over here in, I don't know, let's find the processing section or the collection department. Let's use that, the collection department has got a certain set of rules that this person must go by. So it's not like you can walk into the business and say, well, I don't quite have enough money to pay my bill this month. How about letting me slide? They'll say no. Try it. Call up your credit card company and say you can't make your payment this month, and ask them if they'll forgive it and let you pay it next month instead. And the answer is going to be probably no. And I'm sure you all had this experience. You walk into a retail store. Let's say you want to return an item that you bought. And the first thing that the clerk says is, do you have your receipt? And you say, well, no. And they'll say, well, we can't return the item then. They'll say it's against our company policy to accept returns without a receipt. So that's what they mean. It's against the rules, or it's against these job descriptions. Then you say, well, go get the manager. Well, the manager might have a little bit more authority to make some decisions on his own or her own, but only within a certain scope, again, allowed by the rule book that governs the corporation. We have one here, we've got a similar thing here at UTSA. We call it the Handbook of Operating Procedures, or the HOP, that spells out exactly what every UTSA employee's job is and what we can do and what we can't do. So this is how we maintain organization. This is how we maintain the flow of information up and down this chain and back and forth across this grouping, so that we all know what it is that we're supposed to do. So now even the general manager can get fired and replaced, and all he has to do is read the book, find out what his job description is, and he can take over running the operation. Now, this is necessary, again, to control it. We like to think, oh, bureaucracy means it's difficult and it's hard and it's got lots of red tape and you can't get through it. And it seems like that sometimes, but you got to understand that there are rules and procedures that are set out, and it can be rather annoying. You know, think of, well, the student financial aid department. That's a bureaucracy, and nobody likes that. Or think of the driver's license bureau. That's a bureaucracy, and nobody likes the rules that you have to go by there, but they're necessary for the management of these corporations. Now, the last characteristic that Professor Chandler describes for us here is that ownership is separated from management. And what he means by this is the people that own the company are not necessarily the people that work for the company. And the people that work for the company are not necessarily owners of the company. It comes down to this. Bottom line, can you buy stock in the company? If the answer is yes, you can buy stock, then ownership is separated from management. You can buy shares of the company, become a part owner, be entitled to part of the profit that it makes without having to work for them. For example, you can go down and call your stockbroker and say that you want to buy 100 shares of Apple, and he executes the order for you, and now, boom, you're a part owner of Apple, just like Tim Cook is. Now, you own considerably fewer shares, but you are entitled to the profits that Apple Corporation makes, even if you don't work for them. On the other hand, you could work for Apple and not own any stock. You simply are an employee rather than an owner. So bottom line, can you buy stock? Now, big businesses have to separate ownership from management for two fundamental reasons. One, these big businesses, remember, require a high investment in plant and equipment. By spreading ownership over a much larger circle of people and having millions of owners in here owning various amounts of stock, you can raise the money necessary to maintain the plant and equipment. So the owners invest for profit. On the other hand, most of these owners don't know and don't want to work for the company. For example, I'll give you a personal example. In my stock portfolio, I own some shares of Apple. I own some shares of Microsoft too. Now, trust me, you've seen my computer skills. You don't want me working for Microsoft or for Apple, especially when it comes to designing or writing software, because I don't have those skills. You don't want me, if you're also a shareholder, you don't want me in management, because I really know nothing about running and managing and making the tough decisions required in a modern corporation. So we hire managers. We hire people with MBAs and business degrees, professionally trained managers to run the business for us. And so we just sit back and collect profits while management and the employees take care of business for us. So now, again, if you meet all of these criteria, you're clearly a big business. You're probably on the Fortune 500. If you don't meet any of these, then you're clearly a small business. Now, the gray area, of course, comes in, well, what if you meet some but not all? Let me give you an example. Here in San Antonio, the retail grocery business is dominated by two corporations, Walmart and H-E-B. Walmart is clearly a big business. They have a high investment in plant and equipment. Okay, they've got stores and warehouses and trucks and all kinds of that stuff that costs a huge amount of money. Now, they also have a bureaucratic management structure that distributes authority and keeps order and how this business is going to run. They operate clearly on a national scale. They've got almost a Walmart on every other street corner, it seems like. And clearly, ownership is separated from management. You can buy stock in Walmart, which would be a wise investment because it's a profitable company, even if you don't want to work for Walmart. Now, let's take H-E-B and see if they meet these criteria. Well, H-E-B has a high investment in plant and equipment. Those stores and the warehouses and the trucks and the manufacturing facilities and the offices all cost a huge amount of money. So they meet that criteria. They have a bureaucratic management structure that sets out authority and responsibility that keeps control of the business. Where they don't meet up, though, is they don't operate on a national scale. H-E-B is only a regional company operating here in South Texas. And, well, yeah, they've got a store across the border in Mexico, but that's kind of like South Texas, so it doesn't really matter. By this, I mean there's no H-E-B stores in Oklahoma. There's none in Kansas. There's none in California or New York or Massachusetts or Florida, because they operate simply on a regional rather than a national scale. And the other criteria is that ownership is not separated from management. There are about 6 principal owners of H-E-B Grocery Corporation, and all but 2 of them are members of the Butt family. And they work for the company, they hold the highest management positions within the company, and then they hire everybody else. Now, just recently, H-E-B started giving employees what's called non-voting shares of stock, so that the employees have a motivation to do what's in H-E-B's best interest, not to goof off, not to waste time, not to waste materials, things like that, because now they receive a portion of the profits. The problem is that I or you who don't work for H-E-B cannot go in and buy stock. So ownership is still separated from management in this case, even though that's still a kind of a gray area. Now, keep in mind, H-E-B is a big, huge, powerful corporation, and nobody except for Walmart can really compete with them on a dollar-for-dollar basis. We used to have a grocery chain called Albertsons, some of you might remember. They're not here anymore. H-E-B drove them out of the market. We used to have a grocery store chain called Kroger, which is one of the largest grocery store chains. They're not here anymore either because H-E-B was able to drive them out of business. So H-E-B has many of the characteristics of a big business, but it doesn't quite qualify. So this is just a description so that you know what we're talking about when we talk about big businesses. Now, we mentioned earlier that this starts long before 1870. It becomes dominant after 1870, but we see its first appearance here in the railroads. Railroads are America's first big businesses, and that is, well, simply because they are, by nature, multi-locational. They operate in many different places. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to have a railroad that doesn't go anywhere. So they were also the first to run into some of these problems, like buying these huge machines, these locomotives and the cars and the factories and the warehouses that they need to operate. And they're the first, since they operate on a national scale, to have to come up with this bureaucratic management structure so that people in different parts of the country, in different offices, still know what their jobs are and how to coordinate the business's operation. So the first big businesses here in railroads, because they're the first ones to have to solve these new problems that were presented by industrialization. It's going to make its biggest impact, though, at least in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when this model of big is adopted in the manufacturing sector, in steel, in petroleum, in meat packing, in mining, in a variety of other heavy industries. That's where we're going to see a huge impact, and that's when big business really starts to take off and starts to dominate now in the very late 19th century during what we call the Gilded Age. Oops. Now, if we were in class, I'd ask you a question. Which of the following here is not true about big businesses? And I'll let you look at this for a moment and think about it. I'm not going to give you the answers, though, but I want you to be able to think about this and be able to answer a question like this if you see something similar on the exam. Okay, which of the following is not true about big businesses? Then I'd ask you a question maybe like this. What do we mean by ownership separated from management? And again, I'm not going to give you the answer, but I want you to think about it, apply the knowledge that you've learned, and then be able to answer a question similar to this on the exam. Okay, moving on. Now we know what a big business is. We have to then decide and come to an answer. Why did big businesses form? What was the motivation that caused businessmen to completely alter the way they did business? I mean, this is like industrialization itself. Once big business starts to take hold, it's not business as usual anymore. This is completely different than anything we've ever seen. And that's why it's going to cause some problems. Now, by 1870, and again, this is kind of a random date. We could say 1865 or 1872, but by 1870, many of the constraints that had limited our economic growth have been solved. Remember the components of the Industrial Revolution. All of those were areas in which we had complications or problems that we needed to solve because it was holding back our economic growth. So we turned to technology in part of these things to create steam engines and locomotives and automobiles later on. We reorganized the way we collect and distribute money in banking to raise capital. We made some legal changes. So by 1870, we'd solved many of the problems that we'd been faced with in 1820. Before it really gets started. And we were extremely successful here. So remember, industrialization doesn't start here in the Gilded Age, but what it does is it dramatically accelerates because we'd been so successful. More roads, more railroads, telegraphs, banks. And by, let's say, 1870, most Americans had thought that we've gotten these problems solved. But then here comes the Depression of 1873. And you'll in the book, Henkin refers to it as the long recession. That's one of those big downturns in the economy in 1873. In fact, it was the worst depression we had ever seen in the United States history. And many people were afraid that instead of solving problems, the emergence of these big businesses actually caused the problems, which is not entirely true. Instead, it's a response. Big businessmen, when they get into these periods of severe depression, like small businesses, are threatened with their survival. They could go out of business. And so they're going to have to come up with ways to stay in business. And that's why they formed these giant new styles of a corporation. Now, the success that we had caused new problems. Again, some unforeseen consequences. Now, you're going to see these problems emerge in just about every sector of the economy. You're going to see it in transportation, you're going to see it in manufacturing, you're going to see it in meat packing, you're going to see it in agriculture, because remember, agriculture can be industrialized. Farmers now can produce a whole lot more with these new machines than they could before. Think of the cotton farmers in chapter 16, and then the wheat farmers and the ranchers that you'll read about in chapter 17. So we've been incredibly successful here, and that creates new problems. Now, the example I'm going to give you is in the steel industry. Please understand this example applies in all industries, not just in steel, okay? Happens in all industries. We'll look at this chart of supply and demand for steel. And this is just random numbers that I've pulled from the Historical Statistics of the United States, a manual of statistical data. In 1850, we can look at the supply of steel, represented by the blue line, and we don't make very much. It's in short supply. But now we'll look at demand. We understand demand as in price. So there's a lot of demand. There's more people that want to buy steel than people who can make steel. And that's going to draw a number of people into the steel making business. For instance, Andrew Carnegie, he worked for the railroad. He saw how much demand there was for steel to make railroads and build locomotives. So he quit and started his own steel business. So now, by 1865, we're making more steel, but demand has grown even higher, and so that's driven up the price. There's a steel shortage. By 1870, we've still increased production, but demand has increased even more. That drives the price up. So about 1873, again, more people in the business producing more steel. Price of steel sits at about $131 a ton, the highest it's ever been. Demand is huge. Now, look at what happens between 1873 and 1874. The people that are in the steel business, like Andrew Carnegie and several dozen other steel manufacturing companies, now greatly increase their output. They've got new machines that can make lots more steel, and so the supply increases. That means the prices are going to start to fall. Now they're desperate to sell steel, and so they'll accept a lower price. Now by 1877, remember we're in a depression here, they're still making large amounts of steel, but nobody's buying because of the depression, so that causes downward pressure on the price. Prices fall because there's more steel available and because fewer people want it. Now, here about, let's say, 1885, give or take, what you're going to see is that these lines merge right here, about 1885, give or take. Now, classical economic theory tells us that when supply and demand are equal, there should be a nice, steady, flat line. There's exactly the amount of steel that the number of people want to buy, and so the price will stabilize. Demand will stabilize. But look what happens. Exactly the opposite. Instead, manufacturers, because they've got such a high investment in plant and equipment, to make as much money as they did in 1890 that they did in 1877, they're going to have to produce even more steel. More steel on the market drives the price down. So the only way they make as much money in 1890 or 1898 is to produce even more steel, which drives the price down. Now by 1914, they're making so much steel that they're barely making a profit at all. Now this should sound familiar because this is exactly what's happening to the Southern cotton farmers and exactly what gives rise to the Populist Party or the People's Party that we talked about. That now it seems like the manufacturers and the farmers in the South are no longer in control of their destiny. Somebody else, these impersonal market forces, determine whether they are successful or not. And that, regardless of if you're a farmer or you're a worker at a steel mill, or even if you're an owner at a steel mill or some other factory, that means that you're threatened with your livelihood. You might go out of business or become unemployed. So this is a huge new problem that we've got to figure out some way to overcome. So now, here's our basic problem. We've got too much competition and overproduction. In every industry, there's too many companies making too much product. As the profits start to rise, when demand is so high for these manufactured products, be it steel or petroleum or processed beef or women's clothing or blue jeans, you name it, attracts people into the business. Pretty soon there's too many competitors. There's only a limited amount of business and too many companies trying to compete for that business. So somebody is probably going to end up going out of business. Let me give you an example. Pizza party. You're coming up on Super Bowl Sunday here. Let's say that you want to have a little party. You're going to invite 3 of your friends, and you're going to order 1 large pizza, and you're going to get a 12-pack of beer. So everybody gets 3 slices of pizza. See, we're going to cut it into 12 parts here. Kind of like that. Everybody gets a slice of pizza, gets a couple slices of pizza, and everybody gets 3 beers. That's a good party. That's happy. Now, one of your friends, though, got on Twitter and sent out a tweet that, hey, Steve or Bob or whoever you are is having this great Super Bowl party, and there's going to be beer and pizza. Now, all of a sudden, you got 12 people showing up at your house because they know about the party. Now, everybody only gets 1 slice of pizza and 1 beer. Well, that's okay, but everybody's still hungry and thirsty, and people are grumbling that, wow, this is kind of a lame party. Why didn't he have more pizza and beer here? Well, one of these 12 on their way to your party posted on Facebook, hey, it's a huge party going on at this guy's house, and it's wonderful, and there's going to be beer and pizza. Now you get 96 people showing up at your house. The landlord's going to be upset, but now everybody gets 1 little sliver, maybe just only a bite of beer, and maybe 1 little sip of 1 bite of pizza and 1 sip of beer. And that's really lame. Okay, too many people competing for the available pizza and beer. And that's not good. Everybody now is going to go away hungry and grumpy, and they're going to say that you throw bad parties, and that's not good, right? You don't want to be known as the person that throws bad parties. So that's what you got. Too much competition. Too many people trying to get a slice of that business. Now, all of these companies, remember, have to mass produce. They have to produce at maximum quantity because they've got big bills to pay. Those high fixed costs, that high investment, that's high what we call fixed costs. Fixed costs are bills that you've got to pay whether you're making a profit or not. Think of your rent as a fixed cost. Every month you've got to pay rent for your apartment or your house, regardless of whether you're earning an income or not. And you can't go to your landlord and say, hey, I don't have the rent, let me slide this month. Your landlord says, no, you pay the rent. You've got to pay it. That's a fixed cost. So businessmen are going to be motivated to overproduce simply because they've got to sell something at some price so they can pay off these bills, these high fixed costs that they have. Now, the consequence for all of this too much competition and overproduction, this is going to be good for consumers perhaps. It's going to be terrible for the businessmen. It's good for consumers because prices are falling. That's the consequence here of this overproduction and too much competition. These businesses are competing with each other for such small shrinking markets, that their prices, they're driving down their own prices, which means fewer profits. Now, the one reason a business exists is to make a profit. A business that doesn't make a profit really has no reason to exist, no reason for people to work hard. Profit is the motivation here. Then the problem is that in these periods of big recession like 1873, too many people could go out of business. Now, falling prices, you'd think that would be great. Consumers, think of gasoline. It's about what, $2 a gallon now? Think of how great it would be if gasoline dropped down to $1 a gallon. Okay, that'd be terrible for the oil companies because they're not making enough profit. Be good for you because now gas is half as much. You can afford more gas. You can take more road trips. Be cautious though, because falling prices could be bad for consumers too. What we have then here in the late 19th century is an overall pattern of deflation. It's a deflationary trend. Prices on just about everything are falling. Now, again, let's draw a little chart here. In this boom and bust economy, the overall trend for prices as we get more and more product on the market is prices are generally falling. Price of steel, remember, in 1890 was much lower than it was in 1873. And that's characteristic of just about every product you can name. Gas, petroleum is cheaper, beef is cheaper, ready-made clothing is cheaper, transportation on the railroads is cheaper. Everything is falling, including wages. Wages are falling as well in a deflationary trend. So just because gas has fallen down to $1 a gallon, you might have had your wages cut by half, and gas is still relatively expensive, even at $1 a gallon, because wages have been cut. And that's how many employers, these big businessmen, respond, especially in a recession like 1873. They cut workers' wages to try to save money. That means that the workers, not having an income, are likely to go on strike. They're not going to take this laying down. They're going to protest, probably by joining unions and going on strike. So what we have then is a situation in the late 19th century of falling prices and profits, this broad deflationary trend, and nobody's happy. It's in a situation now where people are threatened with their very survival. So we need new solutions. Business as usual doesn't work anymore. Prior to the emergence of big business and prior to these conditions of too much production and too much competition, businessmen could just, shut down for a month, lay the workers off for a month, shut down business, nobody's working, you've got a surplus inventory, and once you sell off your surplus inventory, you call your workers back and you start producing again. But now you can't do that. You can't afford to shut down production because of those high fixed costs that we talked about. You've got to pay those bills no matter what. So you've got to overproduce. So business is no longer business as usual. So you need new solutions. You're going to have to adapt if you want to survive. And so this is almost Darwinian. To become or to remain successful, businessmen are going to become and form these big businesses. These big businesses, these large corporations then become the best way we found yet of surviving these big ups and downs. Big companies can survive easier in a recession or depression than small companies can. And so this then is the motivation to stay in business when the economy is really bad and to still be able to make a decent profit when the economy is good. So now big businesses become dominant in just about every sector of the economy, let's say by 1900. Big businesses are dominant. Now, here in class, again, I'd probably ask you a question like this. So what conditions motivated the formation of big businesses? What caused big businessmen to form these big businesses, to adapt to these new conditions. And right now, I will tell you that some of you would choose excessive profits. No, wrong. Okay, here I will give you the answer. One of the condition that motivated the formation of big business was excessive competition, not excessive profits. Remember, they're not making profit. Many of them are threatened with going out of business. Now, seriously, I don't mean to be snarky here, but have you ever heard a businessman say, I make too much money? I've got so much money, it's excessive. I can't stand how much money that I'm making. Of course not. Businessmen never say that. So excessive profits, excessive losses are what motivate them to form big businesses. So now we know what big businesses are, and we know why they formed. So now we need to look at how they formed. How did big businesses come into being? And here there's a couple of things: pools, cartels, price fixing, consolidation or mergers, and then this concept, vertical integration, a type of merger, horizontal integration, a different type of merger, and then adopting an American system of manufacturing. Now, we'll cover all of these actually in class, so here we'll leave the podcast right here. Be aware that I might ask you some questions about some of this stuff. Be ready for it. Be able to understand what they are and why they were formed as you're getting in your study time. So we'll leave it here. Get in some good study time and go runners.